On the day of the celebration, when the photographer called the family together for portraits, her voice cut through the room like a knife. "You shouldn't be in the photos." The words weren't whispered. They weren't softened. They landed in the open air, where everyone could hear, and everyone could pretend not to. For a moment it felt as if the hall itself stopped buzzing, as if the silverware froze mid-clink. He didn't answer. He only lowered his gaze, because what could he say? To argue would have made him pitiful. To protest would have branded him bitter. So he sat still, as if invisible in plain sight, tolerated but never truly welcomed. The hall was alive with laughter, children darting between tables, cousins raising glasses, siblings gathering in small, boastful clusters. It was supposed to be a celebration of togetherness, of family preserved through time. Yet here he was, seated slightly apart, as though space itself had conspired to remind him of the distance that had grown between his blood and his seat at their table. He looked at the polished faces, the well-dressed bodies, the flashes of pride in conversations that did not include him, and he wondered, when had he become a ghost in his own family's story? He remembered a time when such gatherings centered on him, when his hands carved the roast, when his voice led the prayer, when his stories filled the silence. Back then, no one questioned his place in the frame. But years of quiet sacrifice, of fading strength and graying hair, had turned him into background, an old man tolerated out of duty, not honored out of love. And now, with one command, you shouldn't be in the photos. His exile was made complete. The photographer adjusted his lens, oblivious at first, arranging the family into neat lines of smiles. But the old man felt the space closing in like a cage. The photos would become history, the albums passed down, the faces remembered. And he would be erased. His image cut away, as though his blood, his sweat, his years had meant nothing. He watched his grandchildren laugh in front of the lens, oblivious that they were laughing on foundations he had built with his own hands. He did not move. He sat there in silence, his heart pounding heavier than the holiday music, heavier than the chatter that swallowed him whole. He felt the burn of shame, the weight of betrayal, but above it all, something colder, sharper, the realization that this was not an accident. This was a choice. They wanted the family to be remembered without him. And yet as he sat there, silent, excluded, erased, he had no idea that one man in the room, holding a camera, had already noticed the cruelty. That one simple question, spoken in a moment of human decency, would turn this night upside down and restore the place they thought they could take away. Friends, let's pause for a moment. Please write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Has anything like this ever happened in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. This is how you help us grow the channel and bring more stories like this to light. And now we continue. When the photographer raised his hands and began to call people forward, laughter swelled in the room. Children rushed to the front. Mothers adjusted collars and smoothed dresses. Fathers straightened their ties with pride. It was a moment meant to capture joy, to press time into memory. But before the old man could rise from his chair, before he could even take a step toward the frame, a voice rang out, sharp and commanding, slicing through the air like glass breaking. You shouldn't be in the photos. The words lingered, heavier than they should have been. Not a whisper, not a suggestion. A decree, public and merciless. Around the table no one spoke, but eyes shifted. Some dropped their gaze to the floor, pretending not to hear. Others adjusted their cuffs and smiled nervously, as though complicit silence could erase the cruelty. For him, it was not simply exclusion, it was erasure. To deny his place in the photograph was to deny his place in the story itself. He froze, his hands gripping the chair, the wood creaking under his fingers. In that instant, every sacrifice seemed to collapse into nothing. The decades of labor, the nights when he worked himself into exhaustion so that his children could study, the times he went without so they could have more, all of it, swept away with one sentence, a lifetime dismissed in the span of a breath. He looked at the family standing before the lens, radiant, poised, ready to be remembered, and he understood. They wanted a version of history in which he did not exist. The humiliation was not in being left out. It was in being told so plainly, so carelessly, that he did not belong. The sting was not silence, but the deliberate act of cutting him away from the frame that should have held him. It was not a mistake. It was a choice. A cold instruction delivered without hesitation, as if he were a stranger who had wandered in by accident. The laughter resumed, shallow and forced, filling the void the words had left behind. The photographer, unsettled, hesitated for a moment, his lens still unfocused, his expression caught between duty and discomfort. But the old man saw none of it clearly. His ears rang with the echo of those words, replaying them again and again until they hollowed out his chest. He sat down slowly, as though weighed down by centuries, not years, and tried to steady his breath. He felt himself shrinking into the chair, disappearing before their very eyes, as though the command had already been carried out. You shouldn't be in the photos. And yet, deep inside, beneath the humiliation, something refused to die. A quiet flame stirred, a dignity unspoken, a truth no one could erase. They could cut him out of the picture, but they could never cut him out of the story, not forever. He pulled at the corners of his mouth, crafting something that looked like a smile, but felt like a wound. It was fragile, trembling, a mask that barely held against the tide inside him. He told himself it was nothing, that it didn't matter if he stood in the photo or not, but deep down he knew it wasn't about a picture. It was about being seen, about being acknowledged as part of the blood and memory that filled that room. His weak smile was not joy, it was armor, the last thin defense against humiliation. The children laughed in front of the camera, their voices rising like bells. They clung to one another, squeezing into rows, eyes shining, faces glowing under the photographer's lights. Sons and daughters tilted their heads just right, adjusting their posture so the family would look polished and whole. Whole, yet incomplete. Complete, yet cut through with absence. His absence. And no one noticed. Or worse, they noticed and did not care. He saw the lines of his life in every detail of that scene. The polished shoes his wages had bought, the jewels that sparkled because he had gone without, the very walls of the house that still stood on the foundation he had laid with his own hands. And yet, in the frame being created, there was no space for him, as though all of it, the sacrifices, the nights of work, the quiet years of giving, had been nothing but dust, swept away and forgotten. He forced his smile harder, but inside his chest it felt like splintering wood. Each laugh from the children was sweet, but bittersweet, because it was rooted in a life he had given them, a life they now wanted to rewrite without him. The photographer snapped the shutter again and again, preserving false perfection, while the one who had built it all sat on the sidelines, erased in real time. Still, he held the smile. He did not want to give them the satisfaction of seeing his hurt. He did not want pity to stain their triumph. His silence became his shield, his weak smile a wall between their cruelty and his dignity. Yet behind his eyes the truth thundered. His absence was louder than any presence could have been. The gap in the frame was not invisible. It was a wound, bleeding across generations, whether they admitted it or not. And somewhere, unseen, the photographer's lens lingered on him, just for a moment, as though it sensed the story behind the mask. He sat still, his body present in the hall, but his mind drifting far away. back into the corridors of years gone. The laughter around him blurred into a dull echo, and in its place rose the memories he had carried alone. He saw himself younger, his hands raw and cracked from long hours at the factory, the night air bitter against his skin as he walked home long after midnight. He remembered how he would slip quietly into the house, careful not to wake the children, careful not to disturb the fragile peace his labor had bought. The smell of iron and dust clung to him, but he wore it like a badge, because every bruise, every blister, was proof that his family would never go hungry. He recalled the endless shifts when his body begged for rest, but he pressed on, because school fees had to be paid, because shoes wore out too quickly, because birthdays should never pass without gifts. He remembered carrying heavy loads until his back screamed, telling himself it was only for a season, only until the children were grown. And they had grown, surrounded by warmth and opportunity, never seeing the exhaustion in his eyes, never hearing the silence of his sacrifices. He had poured his years into them, like water disappearing into thirsty ground, and he had asked for nothing in return. There were nights when he skipped meals so they could eat more, days when he walked instead of taking the bus so they could wear something new. He remembered mending broken things in the dark, his hands trembling with fatigue, but always smiling when the morning came so they would not see the cost. Every corner of their lives bore the invisible fingerprints of his labor. The walls of the house, the clothes on their backs, the very table where they now feasted, all of it was built on his quiet suffering. And yet here he sat, brushed aside as if none of it had ever mattered. The years that had defined him were forgotten, erased, replaced by comfort that did not remember its source. To them, he was irrelevant, a shadow at the edge of the room, too old, too silent, too unnecessary. The bitter truth settled heavy in his chest. The sacrifices that had given them everything had cost him the very place he thought he had earned. Still, in the depths of his memory, there was a glimmer of pride. Though unspoken, though unthanked, though unrecognized, he knew what he had done. He knew the sleepless nights, the quiet hunger, the strength that had built their world. And if they had forgotten, the truth still lived in him. It was carved into his hands, etched into his bones, alive in the very existence of those who now dismissed him. That was something no one could erase. The photographer adjusted his camera, lifting it to his eye, ready to capture what the family believed was perfection. But just as his finger hovered over the shutter, something caught him, something that made him hesitate. He lowered the lens slightly and frowned. The arrangement before him was polished, children aligned in rows, parents standing tall, smiles stretched wide for the world to see. It was the kind of picture families framed on mantels, the kind of image meant to say, "This is who we are." And yet, there was a fracture in it, a presence that was missing, a silence that was louder than their laughter. His gaze drifted to the edge of the room, where the old man sat apart. He was not slouching, not sulking, but simply existing like a shadow against the brightness of the crowd. His eyes carried weight, the kind that years and sacrifice carve into a person. The photographer was used to faces, faces that told stories without words, and in this man's face he saw a story so raw, so heavy, it unsettled him. The lines etched into his skin were not just from age, they were the marks of labor, of endurance, of burdens carried alone. This was not someone who had simply lived long. This was someone who had given everything and been pushed to the margins anyway. The photographer's lens lingered on him almost instinctively, as though the man's silence was begging to be recorded. He saw the faint curve of a smile on lips that didn't believe in it, the hollow look in eyes that had once dreamed but now only remembered. Against the vibrant backdrop of polished clothes and posed pride, the old man's stillness was a wound, visible only to those willing to see. And the photographer saw. He saw the cruel gap in the frame, the absence shaped like betrayal. Something within him resisted pressing the shutter. He knew he could capture the family as they wanted to be seen, bright, united, flawless. But to do so would be a lie, and his craft had taught him to search for truth even when others preferred illusions. His eyes kept returning to the man left outside, the one denied a place in memory, the one whose silence seemed to tell more about this family than their grins ever could. The chatter around him pushed forward. "Come closer," someone said. "Move to the left," another urged. But the photographer's heart was no longer with the posed. His gaze, his attention, his curiosity had shifted. He wasn't looking at the shining faces anymore. He was looking at the one they had cast aside, the one whose story sat unspoken in the corner, like a book no one bothered to open. For the first time that evening, the photographer lowered his camera completely. He knew what he had to do. This picture would not be complete without the man they wanted forgotten. He would not let silence bury what sacrifice had built. The photographer lowered his camera and, against every rule of his profession, stepped away from the center of the room. Conversations faltered as he moved, the family shifting uncomfortably, their smiles freezing when they realized he was not focused on them. His footsteps carried him past the polished shoes, the glittering necklaces, the confident laughter, until he stopped at the chair in the corner. The old man lifted his eyes slowly, startled by the presence before him. For hours he had been invisible, unnoticed except for the cutting words that had excluded him. Yet now, someone stood in front of him, not to dismiss, not to command, but to ask. The photographer leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as though addressing someone of great importance. "Sir, what's your story?" The words were soft, almost reverent, but they struck like thunder in the old man's chest. For the first time that evening, a voice carried respect instead of rejection. For the first time, someone looked at him not as an intruder in a family portrait, but as a human being with a life worth knowing. The old man's breath caught. 100 answers swelled in his throat. Decades of struggle, nights of sacrifice, moments of triumph and pain. He thought of the long shifts that had stolen his youth, the wages spent on tuition instead of himself, the countless quiet acts of love that no one had remembered. His story was written in scars, in calloused hands, in weary eyes. And yet, as he sat there beneath the weight of the question, he found himself unable to speak. Words had been denied him for so long. His voice had grown brittle with silence. Around the room, the family shifted uneasily. Some looked away, pretending to adjust their jackets or check their watches. Others stared, tense and curious, waiting to see if he would answer. But the photographer did not rush him. He waited, patient and steady, as though he already knew that the silence was heavy with truths no camera could capture. Until now. For the old man, the moment was more than a question. It was an opening, a crack in the wall that had been built around him for years. Someone had noticed. Someone cared enough to ask. The respect in that simple request was enough to stir something deep inside, something long buried but not extinguished. His story had been pushed aside, forgotten, dismissed, but not erased. And now, for the first time in years, he felt it rising again, waiting for its moment to be told. The photographer lifted his camera slightly, but not toward the others. This time, the lens pointed at him, the one they had tried to erase. And in that quiet question, the old man felt something shift in the air, dignity stirring, truth awakening, history demanding its place. The old man's lips parted, then closed again, as if the words had grown unused to leaving his mouth. For a moment he sat in silence, the weight of years pressing down on him, the eyes of the room burning into his skin. His heart beat hard against his ribs, not from fear, but from the fragile ache of finally being asked, after so long, to speak. When at last his voice broke the silence, it trembled, not with weakness, but with the gravity of memory. He did not accuse, he did not scold. Instead, his words fell slowly, like stones into still water, each one rippling through the hall. He spoke of the years no one remembered, of nights when his body ached but he kept working, of mornings when he returned home exhausted but still found the strength to smile for his children. He told of sacrifices made quietly, without announcement, without expectation of thanks, the shoes he went without so they could have new ones, the meals he skipped so no one else at the table had to. His voice caught when he described the foundation of the house they now stood in, the one he had laid with his own hands, mixing concrete until his arms were raw, ensuring the walls would stand strong through every storm. He remembered the loans paid off in silence, the school tuitions that drained his pockets but filled their futures, the countless hours of toil no photograph had ever captured. The family listened, stiff and uneasy, but he did not look at them. His eyes were fixed on some distant horizon only he could see, the horizon of all he had lived through. His words carried no bitterness, only truth. He did not say, "You owe me." He simply said, "This is what I gave." And in that quiet honesty, the shame that hung in the room grew heavier with every syllable. The photographer, his hands steady on the camera, felt the weight of it too. He saw not just a man, but a life poured out in service, a history buried beneath indifference. The old man's story did not come out in shouts or accusations. It emerged like a fragile flame in the dark, flickering but impossible to extinguish. And as he spoke, a strange stillness fell over the gathering. The laughter that had filled the air earlier was gone, the polished smiles forgotten. In their place was something raw, something undeniable. For the first time that evening, his presence could not be ignored. His story, trembling though it was, had entered the room, and once spoken, it could not be erased. The room that only moments ago rang with chatter and laughter seemed to collapse into silence, as if his words had stolen the very breath from it. Forks that clinked cheerfully against plates now rested untouched. Glasses that had been lifted in boastful toasts were lowered with trembling hands. The glow of phones dimmed as even the distracted found themselves pulled into the weight of what was unfolding. No one had expected him to speak, much less to reveal the truth of all those years. And now every word he spoke seemed to hang in the air like a mirror they could not turn away from. The sons who once puffed out their chests shifted in their seats, unease carving lines across their proud faces. Daughters who had brushed him aside stared downward, as though the tablecloth might hide their guilt. The grandchildren, who had laughed so easily for the camera, now sat frozen, their young eyes struggling to understand why the man they had dismissed as old and unimportant carried such a story of strength and sacrifice. It was as if the entire room had been forced to recognize something they had worked so hard to bury. The man they treated as a shadow was the very foundation of their light. Every syllable he uttered carried the weight of invisible years, the hunger he endured so they might be full, the sleepless nights so they might dream, the countless labors that had turned into the roof above their heads and the comfort in which they now sat. The truth settled on them like a storm cloud, impossible to deny, impossible to escape. They listened unwillingly, as though his voice was a chain holding them to the reality they had long ignored. Some tried to mask it, fidgeting with their silverware, clearing their throats, offering stiff smiles that dissolved too quickly. But the shame was there, written plainly in the way they could not meet his eyes. The air itself grew heavy, thick with regret, thick with the awareness that they had tried to erase a man who had given them everything. The photographer stood silent, camera in hand, no longer an observer, but a witness to a revelation. He watched the shift ripple through the family like a wave, confidence cracking into discomfort, pride breaking into guilt, indifference collapsing into shame. The room had changed, and they all knew it. Nothing, not even the photograph they had wanted so perfectly staged, could cover the truth that now pressed down on every heart. The old man did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His presence, long diminished, had expanded to fill the hall. He sat, not as a ghost, but as a storm, and though his tone was calm, his words shook the very walls of the family that had cast him aside. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time ever, they truly heard him. And once heard, they could never again pretend he was invisible. His voice, though fragile, grew steadier as the memories surfaced. Memories that had been locked away, gathering dust in the corners of his heart. He spoke, not to boast, not to demand, but simply to uncover the truth that time and ingratitude had tried to erase. He told them how the house they stood in had not sprung from fortune or chance, but from his own bare hands. Brick after brick, stone after stone, his sweat mixed into the mortar, his back bent under the weight of labor that would outlast him. He remembered hammering nails until his fingers bled, patching the roof in the rain so no one inside would ever feel the storm. He spoke of years when one job was not enough, when he rose before dawn to sweep factory floors, then hurried to drive trucks across long, lonely highways, only to return and spend nights repairing anything he could find, just to make the coins stretch further. 3 jobs at once, his body burning with exhaustion, but his will unbroken, because education had to be paid for, books had to be bought, tuition had to be covered. He wanted his children to have what he never did, a chance to rise without chains around their ankles. They had never seen the toll it took, how his body staggered, how his eyes stung from lack of sleep. They had only seen the open doors his sacrifice provided. And then he spoke of the silences, the countless nights when he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, swallowing his hunger, his pain, his fears, so that others in the house could rest peacefully, so that his children could dream aloud without ever hearing the cost. He had been the shield no one thanked, the quiet guardian no one noticed. His dreams were not of riches or recognition, but of their futures, their triumphs, their comfort. He gave up his voice so they could speak freely. He gave up his rest so they could sleep undisturbed. These were not boasts, they were facts. Facts buried under layers of pride, neglect, and arrogance. Facts the family had long forgotten, or perhaps chosen to forget, because remembering them would mean acknowledging the debt they could never repay. His words poured out gently, like water released after years of being dammed, soaking into the silence of the room. Every syllable exposed the truth. They were standing on a foundation he had built, living in blessings he had earned, reaping the harvest of seeds he had planted alone. No one dared interrupt. No one dared deny. Each detail struck like a hammer against their pride, splintering the illusions they had woven around themselves. And in the photographer's eyes, it was all written clearly. This man was not a shadow. He was the cornerstone. And the family's greatest sin was not forgetting. It was pretending they could ever exist without him. Shame has a way of seeping in quietly, like water through cracks, and soon it flooded the room. Faces that only minutes ago had been bright with laughter and false pride now carried the pale weight of guilt. The daughter who had cut him out with her sharp command, "You shouldn't be in the photos," sat rigid, her lips pressed tightly together, her eyes locked anywhere but on him. Her confidence had drained from her body. The glass in her hand trembled slightly, as though even it refused to hide her discomfort. She could not look at the man she had dismissed, because to meet his gaze was to acknowledge what she had done. She had erased the very foundation of her life. The son shifted in his chair, restless, his hands tugging at his cuffs as though fabric could disguise his unease. The stories he had just heard, the nights of hunger, the endless work, the house built with bare hands, were stories he had never cared to ask about. And now, hearing them aloud, he realized the comfort he flaunted had been bought with the silent breaking of another man's body. He tried to lift his chin, to steady himself in pride, but every attempt crumbled beneath the weight of truth. Pride cannot stand in the face of sacrifice, not when it has gone unacknowledged. Grandchildren fidgeted, their laughter extinguished. Their young faces, so eager moments ago to smile for the camera, now reflected confusion and unease. They did not fully understand, but they felt it. The heaviness in the room, the sting of unspoken wrongs. Some glanced at him timidly, as if seeing him for the first time, realizing that the quiet old man in the corner was not just background to their lives, but the very reason those lives existed as they did. The truth, though too heavy for their youth, had still reached them, leaving marks they could not yet name. Everywhere he looked, he saw regret leaking into their expressions. No one spoke, no one dared to break the silence he had built with his words. The weight of ungratefulness settled over them like a shroud, and it grew heavier with every passing second. The old man did not need to accuse them. His presence, his story, his survival despite their dismissal, was enough. His life was the evidence. Their faces were the verdict. The photographer, still standing with his camera lowered, captured it all, not with a shutter, but with his memory. He saw the truth carved into the bowed heads, the trembling hands, the eyes that could not meet the man's gaze. It was the portrait behind the portrait, the one no family ever wants to keep. The moment when pride collapsed into regret, when arrogance was unmasked by dignity. And in that silence, thick and unyielding, they all knew. There would never be another photograph, another gathering, another celebration where they could look at him as they once had. The man they had erased had returned, not in anger, but in truth. And truth leaves marks no one can hide. The photographer's fingers trembled as he lifted the camera once more, but this time his lens did not seek out the polished faces, the practiced smiles, the stiff postures of a family desperate to appear perfect. His gaze bypassed them all, settling instead on the man they had tried to erase. He saw him not as old, not as forgotten, but as the very soul of the gathering, the truth they had hidden and the foundation they stood upon. He took a step closer, his voice steady though quiet, carrying more reverence than the room deserved. "Sir," he said, and every ear strained to hear, "this is the portrait the world should see." The old man froze, startled. For so long he had been a shadow, background noise in the grand theater of his family's pride. Yet here was someone pointing a lens at him as though he were the center, the subject, the story itself. His eyes glistened, not from vanity, but from the shock of recognition, the ache of finally being seen. He did not pose, did not adjust his posture. He simply sat as he was, worn by years, lined by sacrifice, a man carrying the full weight of his life in his face. The photographer pressed the shutter. The sharp click cracked through the silence like a gavel striking wood, like justice delivered in a single instant. That sound carried more power than words. It was the affirmation that his place could not be denied, that his story deserved to be captured, preserved, remembered. For a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. The family, once so eager to shine, now stood motionless, as though the verdict had been handed down against them. Their picture would not be the one remembered tonight. The one that mattered had already been taken. The click echoed in their hearts, each beat of the shutter reminding them of what they had lost when they chose pride over gratitude, appearances over truth. No crafted smiles could undo it now. The photograph of the old man would live longer than their discomfort, longer than their denial. It would outlast their excuses. It would hang in memory as a testimony that dignity, once ignored, had finally been honored. The photographer lowered his camera slowly, but his eyes did not waver. He looked at the man as though to say, "They may not have wanted you, but history will." And in that look, in that captured frame, the old man's silence became louder than all their voices combined. He had been excluded from their picture, but in the end it was their picture that no longer mattered. His image, his truth, was the one that would endure. The photographer gestured gently, inviting him forward, and for a moment the old man hesitated. All his life he had learned to stay in the background, to give space, to endure silence rather than demand recognition. But something in the room had shifted. The weight of truth had already fallen, and there was no going back to invisibility. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he rose from his chair. The family parted in uneasy silence, eyes following him, some filled with shame, some with disbelief. He walked not with arrogance, but with the quiet dignity of a man who had nothing left to prove. Each step was heavy with years of sacrifice, but also light with the justice of finally being seen. When he reached the center, the photographer adjusted his lens, but he did not frame the man as decoration, tucked in at the edge of the group. No, he placed him at the core, where he belonged, not as a prop, not as an afterthought, but as the axis around which the family had always revolved. For the first time, the spotlight did not wash him out. It revealed him. The camera did not capture wrinkles of age, but the lines of legacy. Each crease in his face was a chapter written by labor and love. Each shadow under his eyes, a testament to nights he had traded for the dreams of others. The family shifted around him, uncomfortable but powerless to object. Their smiles faltered, their carefully arranged posture undone by the undeniable presence in their midst. The old man did not smile in triumph. Instead, his expression was calm, almost solemn, as if he were offering them not punishment but truth. His dignity radiated more brightly than their jewels, more profoundly than their practiced grins. In that moment, the photographer captured not a family gathering, but the essence of a life lived in service, a story carved into skin and bone that no one could erase. The shutter clicked again, softer this time, but its sound carried like a hymn. The image that emerged was no longer of children posing or siblings boasting. It was of a patriarch, a cornerstone, the living history they had tried to crop out of the frame. For once, the photograph told the truth. It said without words, "Here is the man who gave, who endured, who built. Here is the center." And though the room was heavy with shame, there was no anger in his stance, no demand for apology. He stood with the quiet certainty of someone who knew that time itself had vindicated him. The camera had restored what pride had tried to erase, and the image now immortalized his place. From that moment on, no album, no memory, no story could exist without his face at the heart of it. The printer in the corner hummed softly, almost reverently, as if it too understood the weight of what it was producing. The photographer slipped the fresh sheet from the tray and placed it carefully on the table, the ink still warm, the image still settling into permanence. For a moment, no one moved. The family stood frozen, their earlier pride curdling into silence as they stared at what lay before them. The photograph did not lie. It had no agenda, no bias. It simply reflected truth. And in that truth, the old man stood at the center, no longer shadowed, no longer dismissed, but revealed for what he truly was, the beginning and the end of their story. The picture radiated something no practiced smile could counterfeit. His eyes, weary yet unbroken, spoke louder than words ever could. The creases in his face were not flaws, but chapters. The stillness of his posture was not weakness, but strength earned through decades of sacrifice. The lens had captured not just a man, but the weight of everything he had endured, everything he had given. Around him, the family looked smaller, their polish and poise stripped of power in the presence of his undeniable dignity. The room, once filled with chatter, laughter, and shallow pride, now held only silence, thick, suffocating, unavoidable. The photograph spoke for him, louder than any accusation he could have hurled, sharper than any words of reproach. It was proof, carved in ink and light, proof that could not be argued away, proof that exposed the arrogance of those who had tried to erase him. They had told him he did not belong in the photo, but here he was, not as a background figure, not as an afterthought, but as the frame itself. Without him, the picture would not exist. Without him, none of them would exist. The daughter who had excluded him shrank in her chair, her face pale as she stared at the image she could never undo. The son shifted restlessly, guilt dripping from every nervous movement of his hands. Even the grandchildren, too young to fully understand, leaned closer, sensing the sacred weight of what had been captured. They saw in that photograph what their words had failed to tell them all their lives. This man was not someone to be pushed aside. He was their origin, their protector, their foundation. The old man looked at the photo too, his heart aching not with pride, but with something deeper, vindication without bitterness. He did not gloat, did not smirk, did not search their faces for regret. The image itself was enough. Justice had been delivered, not in shouts or vengeance, but in the quiet truth of a picture that would outlive them all. That single photograph carried a judgment no courtroom could deliver. He had been the center all along, and no one could erase that now. He looked at the photograph on the table, the ink drying into permanence, and then he looked at the faces around him. They were pale now, their earlier laughter swallowed by shame, their voices locked behind lips that had once spoken so easily. The room seemed smaller, the walls closer, as if even the house itself remembered who had built it. But he did not speak. He did not scold them for their cruelty, did not list their failures, did not demand apologies that would only serve to soothe their guilt. He simply stood a little taller, shoulders squared, his silence heavy and unshakable. There is a power in silence when it comes from dignity, and his silence roared louder than rage. Anger could have been dismissed, brushed aside as bitterness. Fury could have been twisted into blame, but dignity, calm, resolute, unyielding, was undeniable. It forced them to face themselves. They could not look at him without seeing what they had done, yet they could not look away without acknowledging their cowardice. His stillness held a mirror to their hearts, and it reflected everything they wanted to ignore. He had no need to gloat, because the truth already stood in front of them, printed in a single photograph. He had no need to demand recognition, because recognition had already been carved into their memories by the weight of his words and the echo of his life. In that moment, he transcended the pettiness of their exclusion. He was not a man begging for his place. He was the man whose place had never truly been in question. They had tried to erase him, but history does not bow to arrogance, and legacy does not vanish because someone wills it to. The family sat in the silence he created, suffocating in their regret. The daughter's eyes glistened, but no tears fell. The son's jaw tightened, but no words came. Even the youngest, who did not understand the full measure of the moment, felt the weight of it, as though the air itself demanded reverence. The photographer lowered his camera, his duty complete, and yet even he seemed to bow in respect to the man whose quiet presence filled the hall more completely than any crowd could. He did not need to defend himself, because the truth had already done it. He did not need to fight, because the photograph had already spoken louder than his voice ever could. And so he remained standing, steady, dignified, living proof that some victories do not require sound, only the unshakable silence of justice fulfilled. ChatGPT Skazal. Years passed, and the noise of that night faded into the quiet march of time. The table that had once been filled with voices grew emptier, chairs shifting as generations rose and fell, but the photograph remained. It lay pressed between glossy pages in an album that survived birthdays, weddings, and funerals, and whenever the family gathered to look back, children grown, grandchildren curious, new faces joining the lineage, the picture always waited. They turned page after page of smiles carefully arranged, of celebrations half forgotten, until at last they reached it, the image that silenced them all, the image that told the truth no storybook ever had the courage to tell. There he was, Not on the edge, not fading in the background, but standing at the center, his figure steady, his gaze unbroken. The lines in his face told of endurance, of nights endured so others could sleep peacefully, of burdens carried so others could walk freely. Where once those lines had been dismissed as the marks of age, now they were read as scripture, the sacred record of a life lived with sacrifice and dignity. Children and grandchildren who had never met him leaned in close, tracing his features with their eyes, whispering questions to parents who shifted uncomfortably, forced to explain what had once been denied. He was no longer the man left out. He was no longer the quiet figure in the corner, erased from the frame of memory. He was the patriarch, the cornerstone, the beginning and the root of every life gathered around that album. His presence in that photograph did what his words could not do in life. It demanded respect. It stood as proof that legacies built from love and labor cannot be erased by arrogance or pride. The photograph had become more than an image. It was a verdict, a testament, a monument in ink and paper. And over time, as stories shifted and family members tried to soften the memory of their own betrayal, the picture did not soften. It spoke with the same power it had on the night it was taken. No excuses could rewrite it. No denial could blur its edges. It captured not just a man, but the truth. The family existed because of him, and their name carried weight because he had borne it first. His place was carved into history, undeniable and unerasable, not because they granted it, but because he had already earned it. In later years, when grandchildren showed the album to their children, they no longer spoke of embarrassment or shame. They spoke with reverence. This was him, they said, the one who built the house, the one who worked so we could study, the one who gave everything. His silence, once mistaken for weakness, had become his crown. His absence from their recognition had transformed into eternal presence in their memory. And so the legacy lived, not in wealth passed down, not in possessions divided, but in the dignity of a man whose life was finally seen for what it was. The photograph became the anchor of the album, the page no one skipped, the story retold with awe in voices that trembled with respect. Time itself bowed to the truth it held, that love, sacrifice, and honor cannot be erased, and that the man who was once told, "You shouldn't be in the photos," had become the very image by which the family would always remember who they were.